Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm McKenna from Murder by the Book in Houston, here at home for another one of our Facebook Fridays. I think it's Friday, yes. I'm joined tonight with Liv Constantine, the two ladies who make up that name, and Ivy Pochoda. They're here to talk about their latest releases, Wife Stalker and These Women. Liv Constantine is the pen name of USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and international best-selling authors and sisters Lynn, Constantine, and Valerie. Can we get a hands up on who is Lynn?
Lynn.
Lynn, Valerie. Excellent. Separated by 3 states, they spend hours plotting via FaceTime and burning up each other's emails. They attribute their ability to concoct dark storylines to the hours they spent listening to tales handed down by their Greek grandmother. Ivy Pochoda is the author of the critically acclaimed novels Wonder Valley, Visitation Street, and These Women. Wonder Valley won the 2018 Strand Critics Award for Best Novel and was a finalist Los Angeles Times Book Prize, as well as being chosen as an NPR and LA Times Book of the Year. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. While we are discussing, and I'm going to be asking these ladies questions, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. John, our event coordinator, who is silent in the background here, will be feeding them to me for later on. So just to get started, thank you for joining us. Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Hello.
Great to be here. Yeah, you could all be there in person, but here we are.
Yeah,
Yes,
that would definitely be preferable, but at least we can do this virtually. We've just about got it figured out now. So life is pretty hard right now. How are you guys in general? And feel free to jump in. I know there's going to be Zoom delays.
Right. I mean, we're just feeling grateful to be safe and home with the family and be able to do these kinds of things and to write. So just hope, feeling really sad for the state of the world right now and the health, and hoping that that's going to improve. But trying to be cautiously optimistic. So.
Yeah. I feel the same way. There's so many people. We're so fortunate to be able to work at home. There's so many people who can't or who are not working at all. And so there's just a lot of suffering right now, so many lives lost. So it's a very sad time. And I just feel very, very blessed. I miss my kids. I'd love to get a haircut.
I don't miss my daughter. She's 5. I see her constantly every day. I miss writing because I take care of a 5-year-old. But, I live in a beautiful city that is, has a lot of problems with the pandemic, but also is a really nice place to social distance. We're really fortunate. And I've taken a lot of solace in the, book community, which has really banded together during the pandemic. And, I think when this is over, at least the book community is going to emerge stronger because of all the dialogue online and, thinking ideas through and, just knowing people. I feel like I know more writers more personally now than I did even before. So, I take comfort in that, though. Gosh, I'd really like to go see some people and have some drinks outside of my house or something.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. I went to the bookstore today. I went to a local store, Fairfield University bookstore, to sign some books, and it was just so nice to sit and talk with the manager. And we're standing there with our masks 6 feet apart, and signing, and that part was weird, but it was just so wonderful to actually be in a bookstore and see some books.
Were people there? Were there customers and people?
There were customers, yeah. I mean, not a whole lot, and people were being respectful and keeping their distance. But it was. I was so excited about going today that I actually dreamt about it last night.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
It's so weird that first thing you do, I had to go, I had to go mail books to somebody, and I went to this mail depot, and I was like, I'm talking to a sales clerk, and this thing is happening, and this guy's carrying my books in, and I'm writing an envelope. It all felt so special.
Yeah. When we take a walk, and if we see one of our neighbors driving, we stop them and where are you going? Are you going to your entrance? Yeah, we're going to the grocery store.
It was exciting. My husband went to the vet. I was very jealous.
Maybe we'll have more of an appreciation of the mundane after this.
Yes,
I think so. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so about your books, Ivy, you have these women, and I've lost my notes. And then the Wife Stalker is your new release. Can one of the two of you give us an elevator pitch for your book, and then Ivy, your turn after that?
Sure. Do you want me to now, or would you like to?
Go ahead, Lynn. Okay.
Okay, so The Wife Stalker is a psychological thriller taking place in beautiful Westport, Connecticut, centering on two very different women, Joanna, devoted to Leo and the children, Stelly and Evie, this family that she adores, and Piper, a mysterious newcomer who blows into town from the West Coast, who catches his eye and sort of steals her family out from under her. And as the book goes on, Joanna starts to dig into Piper's past and find some very disturbing secrets, but nobody will listen to her. So she's trying to get the dirt on Piper before her children's lives are potentially lost. That's it.
And Ivy?
Sure. So my most recent novel, These Women, I'm going to hold it up. It's a feminist take on a traditional serial killer narrative. It follows 6 women in South LA, where I live, women who we don't tend to see represented in fiction, women who are both traditional victims of a serial killer and victims for other reasons, who are caught up in the ripple effect of a man who is on the loose. The serial killer is not part of this narrative. I don't think it's important to focus on the killer always in fiction. I think sometimes it's important to focus on the victims. And so my book sort of punches a serial killer shaped hole in a traditional, thriller story, and refocuses the, the narrative on the women who are left behind or who are reeling in his wake.
So I know that everyone's schedules are all over the place, and it's hard to find time to write or the concentration to write. Are you writing books right now? Are you writing articles? Are you incapable of focusing? How's that going?
We're in a position where we have to focus, whether we're incapable or not, with deadlines and commitments. So yes, we've written articles, we've written short interview answers. We are editing a book that will be published next year. So we're on our second round of edits on that, adding to and editing. And we're also working on another project that we have to have finished probably within a month. So it's been pretty busy. And actually this has been helpful, not being able to go places and being.
Yeah, it's a godsend really, I think, because I mean, we talk about that a little bit, about if we were in the very beginning infancy of the creative process, it may be a little more difficult with all the anxiety that is pervading us. But because we were in editing, we're at the stage where, not that it's necessarily easy, but it requires a different kind of concentration. So the story's already there and it's finessing, and it's given us something to concentrate on. And I'm just grateful, like, every day that I'm busy from morning until night, because I don't know what else I would do other than, watch the news, which I'm completely boycotting right now. So yeah. How about you, Ivy?
Oh, yeah, no, not exactly writing.
You got the 5-year-old, so right.
I have a 5-year-old. But when you have a book come out, as I'm sure you all know, there's all this stuff you have to do. Questionnaires to answer, people who want to interview you. A lot of people interview you via email, and that takes a long time. Little blog posts for crime reads, and the community is so supportive that right now for me, all of these things take a lot of my concentration. I do write articles for the LA Times and New York Magazine, not very serious ones. I'm not like a serious journalist, but a lot of that is something that 1,000 words now just seems like climbing a huge mountain. I'm like, I need to put aside time. I have this really other odd side hustle writing job. I write middle grade fiction. I write Kobe Bryant's middle grade series, Epica, The Tree of Ekrof. And after the events of February, we had to revise the last book. So I have been doing that. But as for my own work, no, not happening. But it will one day.
Well, I think you're underselling yourself, because I read a fantastic article about stoner foods of the apocalypse. So I know that you are writing and writing enjoyable nonfiction because I've read it.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, but that's where my brain is.
Yeah. And it was so nice to see. I mean, obviously you're at home with your daughter and trying to get through this. And so I know you're writing. Maybe the book will come.
It will. And for me, like I don't write a book a year. It's just a little bit of a different process. So each one takes so long that to then, there's a huge upside to producing a book every year, but you're always rolling. Like I don't have to do that, but then it's sort of like, I'm always confused about what I'm doing next. Or so I'm sure you guys are like generating the idea as you're finishing the last idea, which is its own sort of exciting, but also stressful.
And but it can be a treadmill. You're right.
Yes. Like and I did that with YA.
Turning over continually. Yeah.
It's fun though to know what you're doing.
That's true.
But you're also not baking sourdough all day. You're writing.
Please, no one bakes sourdough.
So speaking of this current crazy situation, does anyone have any plans to put it in a book, or is this something we don't want to read about in the future? What are your takes on that?
I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole personally, just because I feel like living it is enough. But I'm sure that other people may feel differently. But for me, I have no desire to fictionalize
current event.
Yeah.
Having said that, I have no idea what I'm doing. I actually had an idea for a story that it starts with people being furloughed from prison. Oklahoma just furloughed like 400 people out of, especially women, out of the blue. That sort of interested me. And I was sort of thinking about like the repercussions of people being turned back into society. I mean, they did it quite quickly without a lot of, preparation. And then I thought, I keep thinking, if I want to write that has to be a pandemic story, because the jails then just actually did all over the country, furloughed more people. So if you were to write that story, you'd have to make it current. Yeah. And then I was like, maybe I won't write that story.
That does sound interesting. I was reading that during the time that Shakespeare was writing, in the 1580s, the 1590s, the early 1600s, there were plagues, like every other year. And I think for a period of like 4 years, between 1606 and 1610 or something like that, the playhouses were really only open for a total of 9 months.
Wow.
A 4-year span.
Oh, wow.
I thought that might be, not that I would write it, but I thought that might be an interesting thing to write about, just what that was like for people at that time, and the actors and the writers and that kind of thing. And so it's sort of removed, but writing about this kind of world going into the future, I think might be really depressing.
I think if we're not going to do it, everybody else will. So maybe we could just take a back seat on that. Because I just blurbed a book that's incredible, the new Elizabeth Hand book. It's so good. But I have the galley, but somehow she got coronavirus in there.
Wow.
And it's sort of like, it's filtered in there. There's this news going through the book, and it's sort of touched off. But I'm like, how did she even do this? Like, I'm holding this in my hand like 3 weeks ago. And, this was 2 months earlier that we first heard about this problem. Anyway, there'll be no shortage of pandemic literature is what I'm saying.
I was marking fall catalogs today, and there's already coffee table books of, life during the pandemic. So they're scheduled, they're out there, they're purchased. I don't know how much it's going to be in fiction, but I guess the people who are going to beat us to it are already in galley form.
I'm sure.
Tell me, how many of you have watched a program? I was watching Killing Eve, and she was in the grocery store shopping, and she had a little basket over her hand and was picking things out of the shelves, and there were people walking around her. And I thought, wow, she's in a grocery store and she doesn't have a mask on, and there are people around her. And
oh yeah,
some of the things that I'm watching are, and I think Lynn, you said watching a crowd the other day on the television show, it was like, wow, we used to do that.
Parties and crowds, or New York and the subway, and you think, or you have we're going to be there again. I certainly
that horrible feeling like they're all going to get sick.
Well, that was where the dreams I was having.
Those were the good old days, right?
Yeah. I would have a dream. I would be at a party, and I would be saying, "Hey, social distancing! You're getting too close. What are you doing?" It was just like, oh my, that was my nightmare. Yeah.
I saw something on Facebook the other day about, like, remember the good times when we used to blow out candles on a cake and then share it with everyone?
Right. That's true. That's never going to happen again.
I just read about how family style restaurants are going to have to basically close. Like this whole article in LA about like all the restaurants that serve a dish for the whole table and how that's never going to happen again. Like even,
no more buffets, right?
That's okay.
All right. Yeah. Things will change.
So, I have to admit, as I was writing these questions, and I continue to be thrown by this, I want to say that you both chose multiple points of view, but there's 3 people, so I don't know how to say this. Did you all choose multiple points of view for your latest books? I know the Constantine books have had multiple points of view in all of them, but Ivy has, I think, 5 points of view in these women. What drove you to that technique? Or, you know, is there a particular reason that you decided to go for multiple points of view?
You guys
go ahead. Go. Ivy, you go.
Well, my last 3 books have all been multi-perspective novels: Visitation Street, Wonder Valley, and these women, I have to admit, it started for reasons I'm not entirely proud of. I had no idea what I was doing. I started writing Visitation Street in graduate school, and I went to a low residency program where you just send 30 pages at the end of every month, and I was writing a novel, I guess. And so I wouldn't know what was happening at the end of the next month. So I'd start over from another perspective and then another perspective. And when I sold the novel, my editor was like, why is every chapter exactly the same length? It's like, it's because I'm writing homework. They should, they're all 30 pages. But what I realized in doing that, and I'm sure I'm sure it's the same in the Wife Stalker, although of course there's some twisty reasons you must do it. But like, in order to see any situation, it's really important to view it from different perspectives. Like I write about my neighborhood, and my neighborhood is predominantly African-American and Latino, and my perspective of living here is slightly different than my next door neighbors. And, the much richer people who moved in down the street and hate it, and like the long-term African-American residents and the Japanese, internment camp survivor who lives across the street, we all see this neighborhood differently. And if a crime is going to occur here, we're all going to have a unique perspective on it. And if I'm going to tell you about that, like through one perspective, you're not going to see it. You're just going to get one very tunnel vision, like take on it. So in order to create that like 3-dimensional panorama of not just a place, but a situation, I think it's really important to pivot from points of view. Otherwise you kind of lose some of the texture and the resonance. And, like in the Wife Stalker, like it's all about like perspective, so like presenting one perspective sort of does a disservice for the world you're trying to create.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think, perspective is another technique that we use, like in our first book, The Last Mrs. Parrish. Really, the perspective is the way that the twist is delivered, because again, it's the way that something is perceived. So in that book, we have very reliable narrator, but you're still really not getting the full picture because that person's perspective is skewed, and that person is not really privy to everything coming from a limited point of view. So, and I think that we find it just more interesting. I think it's challenging to have one character for a whole book and really carry a whole book. It really has to be a very compelling character to be able to do that. And so we've always had at least 2. And then I write independently conspiracy theories, and in those books have usually like 6 or 7. So again, because of very different things that are happening and different people know different things. So I just find it more interesting. It's what I prefer, reading books with multiple points of view as well. I mean, not that I wouldn't read a single, but I just think it's a much richer tapestry. Wouldn't you agree, though?
It feels like you let's air in the room sometimes. You're like, someone else's perspective. Yeah.
No.
It gets a little stale sometimes, right? If it's just one.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that multiple points of view bring to a story is that you might see the same situation from different people's perspective. And so you begin to see it differently. And I think that it makes your own prejudices and the judgments that you've made, then you start to question them, which is always a terrific thing when you're reading, to catch yourself up and think, oh, wow, I thought this, and it's really not that, or maybe I should look at it this way. A lot of the generational sagas, Susan Howitch was a master of this.
Yeah,
yep. Yeah, this really, really thick book, Penn Merrick, that we both read years and years ago, where, again, it's a family saga and it's generational. And, you know, you're on someone's, completely on someone's team when you're reading it from his perspective. And then you get to the next person who tells you the same story. And you think, I had it all wrong, or I didn't look at it this way. So I think it opens our minds too.
And from a writing perspective, do you two take one character and the other person takes the other one, or how do you do that?
So you mean Valerie and I writing together?
Yes, like do you divide up characters and chapters by that, or do you?
No, we do everything. I mean, we divide it by scenes, but not by character, because our process has evolved. And when we first began, again, with Mrs. Parrish, we did start that way. We did write in multiple characters, but we predominantly split it up. And we realized that because we can't really do that, because even if I'm writing, so in the Wife Stalker, there's Joanna and there's Piper, but they may appear in each other's, or like in the last Mrs. Parrish, there's Daphne and Amber's going to be in the Daphne part, Daphne's going to be in the Amber part. So we really have to both know our characters inside and out, all of them. And so now we develop everything together. We develop the story together. We talk every day and we assign scenes. And then it just goes along that way as we're writing. And we really don't know, we know the ending pretty much. We know the twist, but we don't really know exactly how they're going to get there. And sometimes even those things change. So it just is an evolution every single day, back and forth, a lot of discussion, a lot of FaceTime calls, right? A lot of email. So.
Of course, unfortunately, you can do that nowadays and keep writing. That's great. So we have a bit of an East Coast, West Coast divide here tonight. We've got Ivy in LA, books in LA, and you guys are East Coast, Connecticut. So we have dark streets of LA that are super vivid, as almost a character in the book. And the same thing, the gossipy, wealthy Connecticut areas for you guys really serve a purpose in the book. Are settings like a primary force in the conception of the book? Like you think about where you want to set it and then you come to the story, or does the setting serve the story, or vice versa?
Go ahead.
That's a great question. I think for us, the setting, it seems that the setting comes at the same time as the story, as we start to explore what we want the story to be. And we choose the setting that we feel fits the story and the characters. So wouldn't you say that it's almost a combination and at the same time that it comes to be?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, we've done Connecticut, Maryland. I mean, our next book is going to be Philadelphia and Boston. That just happened to be. So we don't, necessarily stick in one place. And I mean, I don't know that, like, say the last Mrs. Parrish, it probably could have been in a wealthy California, but it definitely has more of an East Coast vibe, I think. And I think that was just a perfect choice for that. But there probably are other, and it was a fake place anyway, it was Bishop's Harbor. So, I think as you can take sort of the spirit and of a town, you don't necessarily have to have an exact place. But for us, yeah, we've never had a story yet that was completely driven from setting. I would say it's characters and situation dictate the setting.
All of my books, though I feel like The Wife Stalker could be set in Newport Beach. Like I've spent like I feel like there's that. But I mean, I spent so much time up in that area of Greenwich and, where, that section of Connecticut that was incredibly vivid. For me, the place comes first. The story may or may not come second. If I'm lucky, it comes. Sometimes it's a struggle. I just have always wanted to write about places. And I didn't really know that. My novel, Visitation Street, which was my first novel that was sort of in a more mysterious genre, was set in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I'm actually from the East Coast, like very much so, clawing my way back. So I'm like Connecticut, Maryland, perfect. Like this is for me. But for me, like I really want to write about neighborhoods and communities. And sometimes I accidentally alighted on the idea that like one of the best ways to explore a place is by having something bad happen there, because it gives everyone something to react to. So, you know, I'd written Visitation Street, which is set in this disenfranchised neighborhood in Brooklyn where I was living at the time. And then when I moved to LA and started writing about LA, I happened to live and work in I lived adjacent to Skid Row and worked in Skid Row and wrote about that. And when I sat down to write these women, I was sort of aware that there was an expectation that I would write about sort of a disenfranchised community, and that felt like a lot of pressure, except that I happened to live in one. I was like, oh, I have to write about this particular neighborhood. And, you know, and because I live here, it was exciting to write about it. And, you know, if you want your neighborhood to gentrify, let me write a book about it, because I'm totally 3 for 3 on like gentrifying. I was like, so I think place is just my favorite thing to write about. And, but I don't belabor it. I'm not like, I need to describe place. It's just the thing that sort of comes naturally, and then figuring out a story that allows you to explore that place is sort of secondary.
Interesting. That's interesting.
It feels like that from your book. Your answers make sense to me, because it feels like you two have characters and you could put them, like you said, in a wealthy place in California or wherever, like a resort style city. And then, but it feels like an LA book. So that's not surprising, but interesting. So I have a question for Ivy, and then I'll have one for Liv. I read a quote somewhere that you didn't understand your editor wanting to put a Dennis Lehane quote on the front of Visitation Street because he was a crime writer and you weren't. But of course, your books are crime books. Would you like to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very happy to discuss that. It was such a weird moment where so my editor was I sold my novel to a totally not crime imprint. So I was in graduate school. I went to one of these graduate schools where they're training you to write for the New Yorker or like Harper's or something. And like crime fiction was not on the radar, nor did I plan on writing any. I was like, I totally thought that I was writing about, you know, cool people hanging out in bars and like misbehaving. And I was like the new, you know, female Jonathan Franzen or whatever, Jonathan Lethem, everyone's named Jonathan, and from Brooklyn. And I was like a Brooklyn writer. And so I sold the book and I was so excited. And then my editor, who's this delightful woman named Lee Boudreau, just one of the best editors, she calls me up and she showed me the cover. And it's a nice cover. It's over here, it's not around. Anyway, it's my husband's office. It was a dark noirish cover. It shows this pier in Brooklyn and the city and the silhouette of New York across the harbor, Manhattan. And she's like, now, what do you think about a big old quote from Dennis Lehane on the cover? I was like, I mean, it's great. It's like a big author. And like, please, like, learn my book. But why Dennis Lehane? She's like, well, honey, you wrote a mystery novel. What did you think you'd written? And I was like, an important book about like young people struggling in New York. And it's now not going to win big awards, but maybe it'll be sold at airports. I literally asked her that. I was like, well, it sold at airports. Like, it's my primary concern. Like, this whole other career I had envisioned just sort of disappeared at that moment. And yes, it sold at airports, and it sold, unlike a lot of literary fiction, which was awesome. And I was like, she's like, well, what did you think happened? This girl goes missing off a raft at the beginning of the book on page 2, and then you find out what happens on the last page. You wrote a mystery. I was like, it had never occurred to me. Like, I had no idea. Like, that was the least important part of it. Like, I showed it to a friend, and she was like, so this person's going to figure out what happens to was June, right? I was like, I guess, like, should that be in there? She's like, yeah, have someone discover what happened. So I like kind of tacked it in there, and it wasn't part of the story. And I was a little bit upset, to be honest. And then it was the best thing ever. Like, everyone I've met in the mystery community has been beyond awesome. Like, the tolerance for different types of books, like, they're like, our books are totally different. And like Michael Connelly's books are totally different. And like Megan Abbott's books are totally different, but we all get talked about together and celebrated together and celebrate each other. And it's literally the best thing that could have possibly happened to me as a writer. And like, it's just amazing. And so, but yes, a total stroke of luck, you know. And I'm never leaving. I'm here to stay.
It's such a funny story to me. Like, yeah,
it's totally true. I remember where I was standing. I lived in a loft. I was standing in my very hot bedroom, and just like, what is happening here? Yeah. Anyway, and then Dennis Lehane wanted to release it on his imprint. So, and he doesn't think it's a mystery either. And we went on a tour together. It was just bizarre.
Yeah. I remember all the marketing behind it too was like 1,000% crime novel. So no one had any question except you. Great.
And but that's a whole. He was like, "This isn't a mystery. Why do they keep asking you about that?" I was like, "You know what you do? Like, it's confusing."
Funny. Okay. The Last Mrs. Parrish was at the forefront of the recent huge domestic suspense trend. Did you intentionally write that style of book after the success of Gone Girl or Girl on the Train, or was it just fortuitous timing? I know you had written something before that, so Last Mrs. Parrish clearly worked out well for you, but how much was that design or just writing a great book to start with?
Well, like Ivy, we didn't know we wrote a psychological thriller.
We were writing women's fiction.
Right. We wrote we had written another book prior to The Last Mrs. Parrish that didn't get published and that we put aside. And when we were just taking a walk at Valerie's one day talking about this different situations in life and saying, wow, wouldn't it be nice if it turned out this way instead? Which, you know, again, we're not, for those who haven't read the book, we won't say what it is. And that's how we came up with the twist for Mrs. Parrish. And so we said, oh my gosh, we have to write this book. And we did. And when we got our agent, again, we thought it was women's fiction. And she said, this is a psychological thriller. She said, it's women's, you know, kind of crosses both sides, but really it is more. And my sister-in-law, I remember when she read the advanced reader first, because both of our sisters-in-law are beta readers. And she said, this is a thriller without a murder. And it was interesting. And so that really, and so that just kind of launched us into that. I mean, I've always loved that kind of a book. And of course I loved Gone Girl. And what I think they found refreshing about Mrs. Parrish, again, was it was right when all of those unreliable narrators were coming in. And with Mrs. Parrish, you know, immediately with Amber, she's very reliable. You know, she's horrible and you know, she's a bad person and she's got bad intent, but you just don't really know. And so the twist is not in tricking you with the narrator's voice, but the trick is point of view. That's where, you know, that's where that book. So it was just, it just came together. But again, it was the story that drew us. We wanted to tell the story of these women and this situation. And then it turned out. And so that's what we write now. And again, I mean, we love that. But in fact, Valerie, I dragged her to Thriller Fest 7 years ago. I went one year and then I said, you have to come. And she said, I'm not a thriller writer. So
I write women's fiction.
Right.
Yes. Thrillers.
Yeah. And Ivy, I agree with you that the nicest, I mean, you know, so many people like David Morrell was one of the first writers that befriended me at Thriller Fest that was so helpful, and all of them, no matter what level they are, they're very, it's just a really welcoming and supportive community. So we feel really lucky to be part of it. Yeah.
There's some good people in it. It is a good community. We're glad to have all of you in it. So you've all written a few books now. What has been your favorite book to write?
For me, I would have to say the Last Mrs. Parrish. We really had a great time writing that. And I think looking back, because the book wasn't sold, we weren't under contract or anything. And so I think there was less pressure when we were writing that because we were writing it. Obviously, we wanted the book to get published and we wanted an agent, we wanted a publisher, but we were still writing for ourselves while we were writing it, and we had a good time. And so I think that subsequently, when you have deadlines and you are under contract, then things becomes a little bit more of a business. Not that should in any way affect the writing, but it does affect the pressure that you feel, I think.
Right. Yeah.
For me, I mean, they're all different, you know, because it takes me a little bit longer. My life evolves over the course of each book. Like I started Visitation Street in graduate school, and then, you know, in the course of writing, moved to LA. And Wonder Valley was like a hot mess. That was not an experience I want to repeat. I had no idea what I was doing. It was awful. I mean, it was great. I loved the book and the material was so important to me, but like making it into a story was like, I would call my parents and like curse them out at like 4 a.m, like from East Coast time, like just woken up on the West Coast. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? Like, I blame you for this. And they're like, what are you talking about? Why are you upset at us? I'm like, this book sucks. These Women was the easiest book for me to write and probably the most satisfying because I had such a clear vision of what I wanted to do. You always read these interviews with writers and they're like, I remember reading this interview with, Jennifer Egan about writing A Visit from the Goon Squad. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I went for a run and like the whole book came to me and I ran so far that I forgot to pick my son up from school. And I was like, you did what? Like, how far did you run? And like, I hate running. And like, just like the whole book revealed itself to me. I'm like, that is never going to happen to me. And just it all up. But it did sort of happen. Like, of course there were stops and starts and I added characters, but I suddenly was like, I know what I'm going to do. Like, I'm going to tell this story from these, at that point, it's 4 women's perspectives. I was like, it was such a relief. I'm waiting for that to happen again. I'm just going to sit around during the pandemic. But, you know, that made it a really enjoyable experience. And also having a clear idea that I wanted to write about women whose voices weren't being heard. And that was going to shape the whole book was a huge relief, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I have my notes for this question literally say obligatory TV or film interest question. Do any of you have any TV or film interest? Because if I don't ask it, someone's going to put it in the comments.
Right. We have The Last Mrs. Parrish is under option right now with Amazon Studios. No, you know, we don't know whether that will happen or not. And the Last Time I Saw You is we're finishing up paperwork for an option with with a certain actor and producer. So that's the story on those two. But again, you know, things seem to be a bit halted right now again in Hollywood. So we're just sort of waiting to see. And then, you know, the Wife Stalker's on submission. So.
These Women is in development from Bruce Miller, the creator of The Handmaid's Tale and Hulu.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. I trust him to tell a woman's story, although the weirdest thing is we submitted it to a bunch of people, only men optioned it. Like there was like all different male producers. I was like, what is going on? I know, it's like 5 different men. That was before it came out. Then, you know, so I'm pretty excited. Who knows what will happen? My husband does work in TV, so I know the chances of having anything made are just completely stacked against you. So I'm just grateful to have cleared 1.5 hurdles. Like someone optioned it, they sold it to a network, but I know this is the scary hurdle. Like, are they going to make it? But I'm just grateful. So we'll see. You know, I'm just happy to write books. I don't write them to become TV shows.
Exactly.
That is not why I'm here.
Yeah.
I also think that you'd have to be careful with how particularly the characters in These Women is handled. So it's good to have someone that you would trust doing that.
Yeah, like all the times that people wanted me to make it, like, can we option Wonder Valley but cut the Skid Row part out? And I'm like, no, that's half the book. And it's also very important. I'm sorry you don't like it.
So I have to say, Ivy, that as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, did she follow these people around to figure out how they talk? And
I work in Skid Row. I teach in Skid Row, so I spend a lot of time on the streets of LA, and I have a lot of different connections and experience. So, and I also served on my local neighborhood council. But I also live a block from Western, and I'm outside a lot, so I hear people's voices on the streets. So it's not like I hang out with people who are prostitutes. Well, I do in Skid Row, but I do hear it, so it is come from some sort of experience.
Yeah.
I'm not saying too much. I'll be clear. Thank you.
So what have you read and loved recently? And I will actually tie this in, excuse me for leaning to see the chat, but we actually have a comment from someone. Patricia Lynn has asked, with all your writing commitments, have you been able to escape into any novels that have been able to lighten the serious mood of this time? So basically, what have you read and loved recently with particular focus on anything that's been a little bit of an escape?
Val, who wants to go first?
There's so much nonfiction on my shelf right now that it's...
Oh yeah.
Go ahead, Lynn.
One of the things that I've been reading is The 4 Agreements, which I've read several times for nonfiction. Just a nice book on sort of inwardly focusing a bit and trying to look at things in a more positive way. I'm reading Wendy Walker, Don't Look for Me. She's a friend and I love her writing, and that comes out in the fall. And that's really interesting because it's a woman dealing with grief after the death of her daughter. And she's, you know, all her family relationships are frayed, and she's out on a rainy night and she ends up being abducted, but her family thinks that she's willingly left because of the, you know, so it alternates between this daughter who the last time she saw her, they had this big fight, and the mother who's abducted by this man who needs a mother for his child. And, you know, and she's lost a child. So it's really very interesting. I mean, it's not that it's light reading, but it's making me escape from, you know, from the world. So I'm really enjoying that right now.
You probably don't want me to answer that question. It's not great over here. I had this idea at the start of the pandemic about, I have this idea of LA as just being a complete free for all Wild West of people behaving badly. So I decided to read some like really gnarly Western novels, like, you know, pretty bloody books about buffalo hunting and, you know, scalping. So, well, I find that somewhat rewarding because it's also like lightning because it's not that bad out here, you know, like, and no one is doing that.
No, I get that. Yeah, you want to see, I can totally relate to that.
I read a book by a friend of mine, David Yulin, about earthquakes, which is great, called The Myth of Solid Ground. And I was like, at least there's not an earthquake, touch wood. Yeah. But it's about dealing with uncertainty and dealing with your anxiety around an unpredictable event. He's like me, a New Yorker who lives in LA, and he was like, I can't deal with the earthquakes, you know, so I read that. But to be honest, most of my reading right now, it's funny, when the year started, I'm like, I'm not blurbing any books. I'm just going to do my own stuff. And then when the pandemic started, writers need your help more than ever. So like I am reading so many friends' books early, not just to give them blurbs, but to like be able to come here and tell you about them. My friend Heather Young has an amazing book called The Distant Dead that's coming out. Not only is she a friend, she's in my actual class at Graduate School of 17 people. And she's got a great mystery. Like, so reading her book, you know, I read Sarah Slygar's Take Me Apart. So nothing light.
Yeah. So thrillers, reading, again, advanced reader copies of books. And I just read a terrific one called Mommy Loves You, which is coming out in September, a terrific thriller. But one of the books that I read, and it's very short, it's nonfiction, it's memoirs of sorts, and it's titled Nobody Will Tell You This But Me by Beth Kalb. Have you read?
Yeah, I have that. Is it good?
Oh my God. It's fabulous. You will laugh, you will cry, it will touch your heart like nothing. It is an amazing, amazing book. And I think it also is in development for film right now.
I think I read that.
But it is wonderful. It's a story, it is the story of her relationship with her grandmother, who, as she's writing the book, is not, you know, that the grandmother is not alive any longer. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
We were both sobbing. Remember Vala, because she was a little ahead and she was texting me. We were doing it for a book club with Zibby Owens, and she's like, I'm sitting here sobbing, and I'm thinking, really? And then an hour later, I was as well. So, yes.
Sent a copy to our sister-in-law.
She was crying. Yeah, it was
I'm sobbing here. I'm just, it's terrific. Highly recommended.
I can sympathize about the reading things that are worse off than you are. We have a new release by Lawrence Wright that's a pandemic book, end of October. It's been all over. And one of the staff members, Sally, loves it. And, you know, half the people, you try to tell them there's a new pandemic thriller that they're going to love. And they're like, I can't do that. The other half, we say, it's not as bad as what's happening. And they're like, give it to me. Because there's something reassuring in knowing it's not quite that bad.
Right.
I will read anything that man writes. I've read almost all of his books. I mean, a huge fan.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question I have for you before doing another comment is, are there any hints on what you're working on now, which I know, Ivy, you are waiting for your idea to strike. How about you two?
So we're working, can't say too much more, but our next book is going to center around a woman with some identity issues. And in this book, we won't have two female perspectives, but we will have a female and a male perspective. So that's a little bit different. Yeah,
great. Maybe you got any nonfiction you're doing today or tomorrow? Yeah.
I see the nonfiction question over there in the chat.
I'm getting to it next.
Yeah.
I figured it was a good one for you. How difficult is it to switch between writing fiction and nonfiction?
It's really hard, actually. You know, I like anything, it's just like when you don't do something a lot, like I find it to get that muscle going. Like when I write a book review, I actually start to, I mean, it sounds ridiculous. I'll start to sweat and panic because like there's like a million people at the New York Times or the LA Times who do this better than I do. Like they do it for a living and they can dash. Like my friend's a really good friend of mine is the theater critic for the LA Times. And sometimes we go to the theater together and then we go have drinks after the theater. And then he's written this review the next morning. Like, what's write that? Like, you know, like it's so good. And I'm like, I just can't do this. Like I have to sound smart. But then if I do 5 in a row, it's really easy. You know, I'm like, oh, okay, like I could do this. It's easy for me to make a transition to writing the nonfiction. That's sort of the lighter stuff I do about myself, like writing about cooking the stoner food for my daughter or my quarantine diary for the LA Times. That I can go back and forth, or writing a profile. But when it's like to criticism, it's really, really hard. Like accessing that part of my brain, it's like takes it's something. It's hard.
You too? Any nonfiction?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Do you two write nonfiction as well?
No, I mean, other than articles like blog posts or, you know, articles for different on writing, but nothing long form nonfiction. Yeah.
My husband writes nonfiction. He's a scientific writer, and it looks incredibly difficult to me to send all of the, all of the information that he gathers, and then he has 22 pages of references, and it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I had enough of that in graduate school. I don't really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When people ask me if I do research, I'm like, I try to do everything possible to not have to do research. You know.
Yes.
All right. So just to recap, thank you all for joining us. We have copies of Liv Constantine's The Wife Stalker and Ivy. I messed it up. What is it? Pochoda. These women. And they've also graciously sent us signed book plates. Ivy says, believe women. Yes. And then we have this one as well. So if you'd like to get a copy of the book, we do have signed copies, signed book plates to go with it. Also, if you're going to be around tomorrow, I'm going to be interviewing Alexander McCall Smith all the way from Scotland at 1 o'clock. He's charming always, so that'll be a treat. And then I imagine some of you will recognize the names that are coming up. We've got Jessica Berry with Kimberly McCrate on June 17th and Riley Sager on June 30th, and lots of other great ones in between. We just updated our website with a lot of virtual events, so make sure to check it out. And if you want any books, you can go to murderbooks.com. You can email us at order@murderbooks.com or call us at 713-524-8597. Thank you, ladies. I really appreciate your time and the great book.
Thank you.
It was great fun.
It was great meeting you both. Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody.
Bye. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thank you.